The Economy of Resistance, Whisperings, Restraint, and the Ascent of Inner Light. 1. Question and focus. When satanic whisperings arise, what reward or consequence is appointed for the human being, and what consequence follows for the devils when the person does not act upon those whisperings? 2. The nature of whisperings. Every satanic whisper serves as a deliberate spiritual snare laid for the human being. Just as a living creature caught in a trap is deemed ensnared and burdened by consequence, the whispering is intended to lure a person into ethical failure and inner fracture. However, this question pertains not to those who fall into temptation, but specifically to those who resist it, those who perceive the snare and avoid it altogether. 3. The reward for resisting. When a person resists the whisper and escapes the snare, they are granted a reward equivalent to having performed the corresponding virtuous act that directly counters the intended transgression. This reward becomes even more weighty and consequential when the individual possesses full ability and opportunity to carry out the act, such as physical vitality, financial resources, social influence, or strategic acumen, yet consciously and deliberately chooses restraint over indulgence. 4. Suppression of anger and desire. And an even greater reward is granted to those who, in such moments, endure harm from others that stirs anger within them, yet consciously suppress that anger or restrain carnal desire. Such individuals are granted immense spiritual recompense and may be counted among the people of gardens of delight, Jannat al-Na'im. As the Almighty has declared, the one who fears the presence and majesty of God and withholds the ego from fulfilling its corrupt desires, such a person earns the eternal refuge of paradise. Of 5. Prophetic validation of moral restraint. Likewise, in a noble hadith, it is stated that among the 7 categories of people who will be granted the honor of sitting beneath the shade of the divine throne on the harrowing day of resurrection, one is the person who had full power, full opportunity, and full capacity to commit a major moral transgression, yet refrained purely out of reverence and awe for God. Exalted is he. Such self-restraint renders them a living embodiment of the verse just cited, not merely its reciter. 6. Consequences for the devils. As for the devils, when they generate a whisper and attempt to incite a person to act upon it, yet fail to bring that action into realization, they receive no reward, compensation, or advancement whatsoever. On the contrary, when a person repeatedly resists their whisperings, that failure becomes a source of torment, humiliation, and diminishment for the devil, because the collapse of that temptation results in the human being attaining a higher spiritual station within the inner self. In this way, the devil's defeat becomes the believer's elevation. 7. Inner light and spiritual ascent. To the devils, nothing is more perilous than a human being drawing nearer to the divine, by any means and in any form. Accordingly, when a person resists their whisperings and refuses to act upon them, a subtle yet real light begins to stir within their inner being. Even if the individual lacks the perceptual sensitivity or psychological readiness to fully recognize this radiance, its reality is not diminished, for God, glorious is He, grants an increase of inner light regardless. This unseen growth often manifests outwardly as newfound strength, clarity, stability, or peace. 8. Joy and restraint. With careful reflection, one often discovers that when a person holds themselves back from an unethical or morally compromising behavior and escapes the snare intact, they experience a distinct and unmistakable sense of joy, sometimes accompanied by heartfelt relief, inward gratitude, or quiet thankfulness for having been protected from falling. 9. Divine light as reward. And if a person refrains from committing a major transgression or serious temptation purely for the sake of God, then a complete and powerful light is granted to them instantly. That moment becomes imprinted as a profound inner memory, so formative and enduring that it is often retold in social circles and across various media platforms as a defining moral experience. We frequently encounter such testimonies from those who have undergone these trials and emerged with greater clarity, firmness, and inner strength. 10. Deceptive plots of the devil. This is among the most refined and insidious strategies of the devils, to lead a person into harm within a purposeless situation, where suffering, exposure, or loss occurs, yet the person receives nothing in return, not even the slightest personal benefit or gain. 11. Modern example, theft and exposure. For example, a devil whispers to someone at a self-checkout lane, "No one is watching, just take it. It is easy." At the same time, he stirs suspicion in the security staff, prompting them to monitor that very lane. As the person walks out, they are immediately stopped and searched, caught in a trap deliberately orchestrated by the devil, who incited the theft in one heart while awakening vigilance and suspicion in another, ensuring downfall from both ends simultaneously. 12. Example, relationship temptation. A person is lured away from their committed relationship by fantasies projected through social media or digital flirtation. The devil fuels these illusions, etching vivid scenes of intimacy and emotional fulfillment onto the canvas of imagination. Meanwhile, he provokes suspicion, exposure, or disruption on the other side, perhaps through a partner, a public disclosure, or a sudden turn of events. Before the imagined union ever materializes, the person falls into scandal, emotional collapse, or public disgrace, drawn into a downfall engineered through manipulation on both ends. 13. Summary and final insight. And these are only a few among countless such manifestations. In short, devils of this kind are rewarded most when they succeed in provoking conflict that escalates into widespread moral, emotional, or social turmoil, while the person they manipulated emerges with nothing but loss from the entire ordeal. Yet this raises a deeper structural question, one that the next chapter addresses directly. If devils gain no reward when a whisper fails, and if their defeat becomes the human being's ascent, then by what principles are their actions measured, audited, and compensated when they do succeed? What internal metrics govern their performance, and how is influence evaluated within a hierarchically enforced system of sabotage, manipulation, and moral inversion?